Save on O'Reilly Brake Parts Cleaner. Get 2 cans of O'Reilly Brake Parts Cleaner for just $8. Valid in-store only at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
History as it happens, July 23rd, 2024. Open convention.
President Biden will step aside as the presumptive Democratic nominee.
Biden wrote, quote, that it has been the greatest honor of my life to serve as your president.
We do have the first public statement from Vice President Kamala Harris in the aftermath of President Biden dropping out.
Qualities that Beau revered in his father are the same qualities that I have seen every day in our president. His honesty, his integrity, his commitment to his faith and his family, his big heart, and his love, deep love of our country.
Open nominating conventions used to be the norm, but it has been a while, like 50 years. With President Biden now out of the race, might we see a truly open Democratic convention next month in Chicago? Probably not, because while the history is fascinating, the potential for chaos is real. That's next with Michael Kazin as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for
delegates to this convention do not know that thousands of young people are being beaten in the streets of Chicago.
And what is your name, sir? Take your hands off of me.
Dan Riley.
Unless you intend to arrest me, don't push me, please. I know you won't, but don't push me.
Tear gas has been used as the demonstrators are attempting
sadness that we feel over the troubles and the violence which have erupted regrettably and tragically in the streets of this great city.
Yes, I actually was arrested at the convention, not actually for demonstrating, but for wearing a pin, a radical pin for the group Students for Democratic Society. But in all honesty, I had broken some windows in downtown Chicago. I was a 20-year-old hothead at the time, and I was very, very angry about the war.
The debate in June between Donald Trump and Joseph Biden may go down as the most consequential televised debate ever in American politics.
Child care, elder care, making sure that we continue to strengthen our health care system, making sure that we're able to make every single solitary person eligible for what I've been able to do with the COVID, with dealing with everything we have to do with, look, if we finally beat Medicare.
Thank you, President Biden. President Trump?
Well, he's right. He did beat Medicare. He beat it to death, and he's destroying Medicare.
For 90 minutes, the incumbent Democrat struggled to coherently respond to questions about his record and his opponent. That night, even before the debate ended, it was painfully evident Biden could not continue. Donors and commentators began calling on him to withdraw, and now, 3 weeks later, he has done what only 2 incumbent Democrats did in the past century or so: not seek another term. Although Biden's situation is different, he was the presumptive nominee already.
There are 40% fewer people coming across the border illegally. That's better than when he left office. And I'm going to continue to move until we get the total ban on the total initiative relative to what we can do with more Border Patrol and more asylum officers.
President Trump?
I really don't know what he said at the end of that sentence. I don't think he knows what he said either. Look.
So after the debate, I started putting together this episode because an open convention in Chicago next month suddenly became a possibility. What if several Democrats vied to replace Biden on the ticket? Well, from the 1830s to the late 1960s, nominating conventions were more or less open affairs, not the made-for-TV infomercials we now have, where the nominee is foreordained by the results of the primaries. I had planned to publish this episode last week, but the attempted assassination of Donald Trump forced me to change plans. And then, after Biden dropped out over the weekend, when I happened to be vacationing in Harper's Ferry, I had to get our guest back on the Zoom for additional comments. So I think we're ready now. Michael Kazin is a distinguished historian of social and political movements at Georgetown University and the author of What It Took to Win, A History of the Democratic Party. Welcome back, Michael Kazin, and let's begin with the historical import of Biden's announcement. This just doesn't happen very often.
No, it's really just the third time that a Democrat incumbent has decided not to run for re-election. Big difference. The other two were Harry Truman, who made that decision way before the convention happened. Back then, in 1952, primaries didn't decide who got nominated. The convention did. So by the time the convention took place in Chicago, actually in 1952, he was no longer a factor. He was very unpopular, partly because of the Korean War, partly because of inflation, other issues at the time. The famous one, of course, 1968, when Lyndon Johnson, who had won a landslide victory in 1964, decided on the last day of March 1968 not to run for re-election. A recent biographer of Lady Bird Johnson has argued that he actually had promised her he would not run for re-election because his health was known to be poor. He had heart problems. She was afraid he wouldn't last out the term. But I think ambitious, relentlessly ambitious, ferociously ambitious politician like Lyndon Johnson would have gone against his wife if he thought he could have won in 68. But in fact, he was very unpopular because of the war in Vietnam, primarily because of racial conflict in many cities at the time as well. And so he bowed out. But his vice president, this is a similarity, his vice president, of course, got the nomination, Hubert Humphrey, in 68, and went on to lose narrowly in the popular vote, but pretty decisively in the electoral vote to Richard Nixon.
That's right, and we'll return to 68 in this conversation. I think as a historian, you want to take time before drawing any definitive conclusions about what is going on. But, we're living in an era of hot takes, instant takes. Some people are lionizing Joe Biden, calling him a great American, a great statesman who has a wonderful record of accomplishment. I want to ask you about why, in your view, his achievements haven't really translated, even before the debate, to popularity. But let me share something with you that the historian Adam Tooze said on Twitter. So monarchical is the American conception of presidency that Biden is feted as a ruler who gave up power in favor of an anointed successor, rather than a vain politician who misjudged his sell-by date and has been belatedly persuaded to spare himself humiliation and give his party a chance. What do you think of that?
Well, Adam's a very smart guy. He's a great economic historian. And I think both are true. Look, on the one hand, yes, in the U.S., unlike most countries, the head of state, the symbolic head of the country, is also the head of government, which is the governing force in the country. Most of other countries, like Great Britain, for example, they have a king and a prime minister, very different roles that they serve. Most Americans do, I think, see the president as sort of, in the old days, medieval people saw a good king or a bad king. The character of the monarch matters a lot. The character of the president is supposed to matter a lot, which is not true necessarily of a prime minister. So how do you evaluate Biden? Well, it is early, of course.
Well, you mentioned Truman before. Sorry to interject, Michael. I mean, his popularity was like 25% when he decided not to run again. But today, a lot of historians look back on his presidency and they judge it more or less as a success. So maybe that'll happen here. But go ahead.
Well, again, how historians judge a president depends a lot on what they think of his accomplishments. There are presidents who accomplished a lot, like Andrew Jackson, for example, who most historians on the left think was a horrible person and a horrible president because he was responsible, before he became president, for genocidal wars against Native Americans. He was in favor of expanding slavery and so forth. So at the time, he was considered a very successful president. And 30, 40 years ago, if you had polls of presidents, Andrew Jackson would rank pretty high. I don't think he ranks quite as high today. No. So accomplishing things sounds like a very neutral term.
Maybe consequential. Consequential is a better word.
Exactly. Right. But still, the content of what you do, the consequences of what you do. Well, for Biden, he did, I think, move the Democratic Party to the left. He responded to the grassroots of the party moving to the left. People like Bernie Sanders. Sanders is 2 runs for president, certainly galvanized a lot of people who had not before identified as Democrats and began to because they liked Bernie Sanders kind of Democrat, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez kind of Democrat. And he responded to that, I think, once he got elected in 2020 by espousing some of the policies that he did not espouse when he was vice president. He had not espoused when he was a moderate. He became really probably the most, at least rhetorically, most pro-union president in American history. He began to be a very devoted exponent of renewable energies and transition to a green economy. He also talked about trying to pass higher taxes on the rich. He did get Congress to pass a very far-reaching infrastructure bill. For a while Democrats had a majority in Congress, they did pass a lot of money for childcare for a lot of working-class people. And these are all kinds of programs, kinds of policies that progressive Democrats have been supporting for years. But as a centrist Democrat, Biden never really has supported. If he supported them, very meekly and behind the scenes, so to speak. So if you're progressive, I think you see he began what they hope is a process of producing consequential changes to the left in American government.
But historically speaking, I mean, you know this, if the economy is pretty strong as it is, despite all the problems we may have, I've discussed this ad nauseum on the show in recent weeks. But, if things are going pretty well and the United States is not fighting any wars like Vietnam in 1968, usually the incumbent benefits from that. But it never really happened here. Biden took over in very difficult circumstances, coming out of a pandemic, the chaos of the Trump years, the January 6th riots. And, most times you get a honeymoon period, and Biden started off pretty strong on the legislative front, but it didn't stick. And his popularity never really recovered. It went down into the 30s and the 40s. And I don't know, I'm having a hard time figuring out why that is.
Yeah, sure. There's a few things happening. First of all, we are very polarized by party. So, yes, he won by 7 million more popular votes than Trump did in 2020, but that's only 51% of the vote. His popularity rating never went up to more than 54 or 55% of the vote. And then he had a pretty chaotic, disastrous exit from Afghanistan, and then his popularity went down right after that and has never gone over 50% since. So in terms of foreign policy, he was not seen as all that successful. And the Gaza war, of course, split Democrats more than it split Republicans. So that's been a problem for him as well. For a while, I think, at least since the Great Recession in 2008, Americans have showed in polls that they're not happy with the way the country's going. There's a lot of dyspepsia, cynicism about where the country is going. And so Trump had a problem with that as well, and so does Biden, I think. Despite the fact the economy has come back pretty well since the pandemic, inflation also went up, and inflation is something which always scares people. One of the reasons that Jimmy Carter lost his bid for re-election in 1980, because inflation was so high. And the other thing going on is that Biden is not a figure who's ever been able really to inspire people in any great extent, not able to win people over. If you're not on his side to start with, he doesn't really get you on his side. And so that, I think, is a big problem, too. So you have the context, difficult for any incumbent, any president in this polarized environment, kind of unhappiness with the way the country's going more generally, which has been around with us for more than a decade, I think. And the fact that Biden is a veteran career politician who never really rose above that to become the kind of charismatic monarch that Adam Tooze was referring to.
And you mentioned Carter there. He appointed Volcker head of the Federal Reserve. Volcker allowed interest rates to skyrocket to defeat inflation. That caused a recession in 1980. And of course, that did not help Jimmy Carter's chances against Reagan that year. No one wants a recession when they're running for re-election. And you also mentioned Humphrey, and I'll ask you about this now as we transition. One question about Kamala Harris, what she has to accomplish here. Humphrey had trouble escaping the shadow of his boss. Isn't that really the challenge here for Kamala Harris, to show that she is her own person, to establish herself as a candidate now?
I wouldn't say that's the main problem. Okay. Humphrey was, if I can use the term on family radio, on a family podcast, Johnson bragged that he had Humphrey's pecker in his pocket. And of course, that wouldn't work for Kamala, given her gender. But I don't think anybody's really seen Kamala Harris ever as sort of a toady for Joe Biden. Her problem is that she's a San Francisco liberal, and she has to win over people in the swing states, in the Midwest especially, maybe in places like North Carolina and Georgia and Arizona, if there's still a possibility for Democrats to win there. The excitement among progressive Democrats is pretty high right now, but the excitement among people who voted for Trump maybe once and switched back to Biden in 2020 probably is not that high. And she has to win those people over. And that won't be easy. Humphrey's problem was that he had to win over people who had opposed the war in Vietnam. Yeah. Harris doesn't have that kind of problem, but she does have to win over swing voters. And right now, we haven't seen polls yet, but I bet she'll be behind. Not as much as Biden was behind, but she'll still be behind. Yeah. So it's by no means a certainty that she'll be able to catch up to Trump.
Yes, my fellow Democrats, we have have recognized, and indeed we must recognize, the end of an era and the beginning of a new day. And that new day belongs to the people, to all the people, everywhere in this land of the people, to every man, woman, and child that is a citizen of this republic. Yes, the new day is here. Across America, throughout the entire world, the forces of emancipation are at work. We hear freedom's rising chorus. Let me live my own life. Let me live in peace. Let me be free, say the people.
Hubert Humphrey accepting the Democratic nomination 1968 in Chicago as all hell broke loose out on the streets. Safe to say Democrats today do not want to see a repeat of that chaos next month in Chicago. So Michael Kazin, let us now talk about the fascinating history of nominating conventions. Open conventions used to be the norm, right?
For the most part, when an incumbent was running, usually it was assumed, at least until recently, this year as well, that the incumbent would be renominated unless he was very, very unpopular or just decided not to run again, which did happen in the 19th century, quite a few times, in fact, very seldom in the 20th century. So delegates to major party conventions were not chosen by primaries or by open caucuses, the way they have been since the early 1970s. They were chosen by party bosses in counties, in states. They were chosen because the bosses thought a particular candidate was the most available man, which is the way they used to be described back in the 19th century. So when you got to the convention, there were different candidates who were supported by groups of delegates. Some of the delegates actually were told by their party bosses in their states or their counties to vote for whoever seemed to be the strongest candidate at the convention. So conventions were pretty exciting events, actually, because they were pretty open. And many conventions in the 19th century, in the early 20th century too, went to several ballots. It was pretty rare when an incumbent was not running for the convention to only go to a first ballot.
You know, the founding generation, they were not fans of political parties or factionalism. But of course, they all eventually became part of one or the other political parties, the Federalists or the Republicans, the Jeffersonians, pretty early on. But they still had to figure out and work their way through how a party system, if you will, would work. For instance, how to pick a candidate or a nominee. There was something called the caucus system, right? We're talking about, this is pre-1832 Andrew Jackson and the very first Democratic convention. You cover this territory in your latest book about the history of the Democratic Party. We're talking very early on here. There was something called caucuses where elites would just choose someone. Help me out here.
From 1800 up until 1824, and to some degree 1828 as well, you had a caucus in Congress, which decided on candidate or several candidates. Sometimes the caucus split. As in 1824, for example, there was only one party, really. There was not a multi-party system at the time. The Republican Party, sometimes called Democratic Republican Party, was the only party. The Federalists had fallen apart. And so there were, I think, 5 different candidates who were chosen. And that was chaos because in the end, the candidates who came in second and third in the popular vote got together to put together their representatives who supported them and defeated, in a general election, and defeated the candidate Andrew Jackson, who won the most popular votes. So King Caucus, as was known, was dethroned after 1824. I mean, in 1828, Democrats got together and all pretty much supported Andrew Jackson. Also, the National Republicans, they were called, supported John Quincy Adams, who was the incumbent. And then, as you say, by the 1830s, both major parties were holding conventions, and they were often contentious places, but the caucus in the Congress was no longer choosing the candidate just to be ratified by the rest of the party.
Yeah. I was reading an article at history.com. The very first convention, or the first party to hold a convention prior to Andrew Jackson 1832, was in 1831, the Anti-Masonic Party. What are they called? Not freeloaders. Freemasons, and there were people who were opposed to the Freemasons. That was a different era.
Yeah, the Anti-Masonic Party is kind of interesting. I won't spend our time going into it too much. Yeah, the Masons were a powerful group In the early to mid-19th century in America, most presidents were members of the Masons. If you wanted to make it in business in many parts of the country, you had to be a member of the Masons. And so those who opposed that were sort of the populists of their day, small p. They thought the Masons were an elite conspiracy against the common people. And there were some future abolitionists like Thaddeus Stevens who were prominent anti-Masons because they thought that slaveholders were holding America in the grip of the Masonic conspiracy. So they held a convention in order to publicize their message. And then the National Republicans, who became the Whigs, and the Democrats picked up on that and began to hold conventions.
There's a massive Masonic temple not far from where I live in Washington, D.C. on 16th Street. It's a huge building. It's rather beautiful, the architecture. I've never gone in there. I don't know if I'm even allowed to walk in there. I'm not a Mason. So anyway. So these early conventions, were these democratic, lowercase d, democratic affairs? I mean, how did someone become a delegate who would then go to the convention and vote in as many ballots as it took on a nominee? Because, you know, the people who were in the running for the presidency in those days, they did not campaign themselves. Why don't you pick it up from there?
In the 19th century, there was an ideology called republicanism with a small r. That is the idea that men of virtue, well-educated men, the kind of men you wanted to be president, wanted to be the most powerful man in the land, were not supposed to seek the office. The office was supposed to seek them. That's exactly the way it happened with George Washington, who famously decided he would leave Mount Vernon to serve the country one more time after American independence was won. He'd be the first president. So that was the model for presidential candidates. And that model was broken much later, in the late 19th century, by William Jennings Bryan, who did campaign very hard for himself. But before then, both Republicans and Democrats nominated men who accepted the nomination, giving a long speech, accepting nomination from the national committee of their party, but you weren't supposed to go around the country by train campaigning for yourself. That was thought to be unseemly, unvirtuous. But to go back to how delegates were chosen, as I mentioned before, they were chosen locally and by states, by the leading men in your party, in your locality. And that meant there were a lot of favorite sons. That term favorite son is probably not for your younger listeners. You probably haven't heard that term before. But states often pushed a particular candidate who came from their states, who they would try to convince delegates from other states to support. Those favorite sons had delegates who were pledged to them, at least on the first ballot. And so they went to the convention. And that led to a lot of horse trading, a lot of private meetings in so-called smoke-filled rooms to try to figure out who the best candidate would be. And very often there are multiple ballots because you had to test the strength of the leading candidates, favorite sons or not, over the course of several ballots, because it wasn't quite clear when you went to the convention who had the upper hand.
It was politics.
That's why they were very exciting, but also they could be quite chaotic as well.
Yeah, it could lead to chaos. We'll get to a couple of those examples. But it was politics, and maybe even a healthy process in some cases, but not necessarily very lowercase d democratic. So the Democrats had this rule called the two-thirds rule. It started in 1844, meaning the eventual nominee didn't need 50% plus one. They needed to get two-thirds of the delegates' votes in order to secure the nomination. It lasted until 1936. Why did it start in 1844? I know you were not at that convention, but you are a historian. Had something to do with Martin Van Buren.
To make it simple, Van Buren was the front runner, and Southern delegates were already beginning to cool on him, even though he had been president in the late 1830s and he'd been Jackson's right-hand man, really the main creator of the Democratic Party in many ways in the 1820s as well. But he already was seen as a little soft on abolitionism by a lot of Southerners. And so the two-thirds rule was basically instituted in order to give Southerners a veto. It's very clear the solid South was the most important bastion of Democratic Party strength in the country, and it continued to be so really into the 1930s. And so this made sure that no candidate could be nominated by the Democrats who did not have a lot of Southern support, not all Southern support, but a lot of Southern support, because two-thirds meant that probably at least half of the delegates to most Democratic conventions actually were from the South, border states, and also the Deep South. So that's why it was instituted. And that continued to be in place for the Democrats because they so much needed the South. They could not win presidential elections without winning the South. No election Democrats won up until 1936, actually. They could have won it all if they had lost a large portion of the South.
It was a sectional veto, essentially, the two-thirds rule. Into the 20th century we go. See how fast I cover ground here, Professor Kazin? Michael, as you insist I call you. we're going into the 20th century here, and there are primaries, but they're not decisive. So, for example, 1912, a very important year, and this is why Woodrow Wilson wins, because the Republican ticket split. There were two different Republicans running. Of course, Teddy Roosevelt ran as a third party, or the Progressive Party, and he took away too many votes from Taft. That's the outcome. But to get there, there were primaries. 13 states held primaries in 1912. Teddy Roosevelt did pretty well in those primaries. He secured a lot of delegates, but he was denied the nomination at the Republican convention. And so this is what I'm getting at here. This is the origins of, I guess, what we would call a mixed system. Some primaries, but the convention is still most important. And this is what leads to, well, people saying, this isn't very democratic at all. So tell us a little bit how 1912 unfolded and what the enduring importance of it was.
Well, primaries are interesting, Martin, because first of all, there were primaries in the states for state offices before then. There are a lot of competitors for governor, for representative, for various other offices in the states. And the parties were mass institutions, and they couldn't just say, okay, forget about someone who's an important person in their community who wants to run for a particular office. They had to give them a chance to compete. But because of the tradition of national parties making the decision in their convention, and the party bosses were very clear. They wanted to make sure they found the best candidate who could run for president, not just the most popular one among other Democrats. They held on to that tradition of not having primaries for the presidential nomination. Well, progressives, reformers that is, didn't like bossism. They opposed the corruption they believed was endemic to boss-led conventions where people would pay other people off to get delegates on their side. At least that was the charge. And so in some states, like New Hampshire, one of the first primaries, they decided, well, let's let the people vote. Now, the problem was, first of all, those primaries did not pledge delegates to vote for a particular candidate on the first ballot. They were advisory in many ways. And also, as you mentioned, there were not enough of them. Even if they were pledged delegates who were selected in those primaries, there were not enough of those primaries, not enough of the delegates who were chosen to make a majority. So in 1912, for example, even though Roosevelt was far more popular among rank-and-file Republicans, the incumbent was William Howard Taft. The incumbent was able to select his friends and allies in the states, were able to select enough delegates to put him over the top. For example, the Republicans were very much the minority party in the Deep South because of the Civil War, the end of Reconstruction, but there were still Republican delegates from Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, places like that, where Republicans never won the electoral vote. And that meant that Taft could choose delegates from those places who were loyal to him. So Roosevelt bolted from the party. He said, we stand in Armageddon and we battle for the Lord. He walked out of the convention and became the candidate of this new progressive party and actually came in second in the popular vote to Woodrow Wilson. Taft, the incumbent, came in third. That's never happened before. And then primaries continued to grow, but still the party establishment, if you will, kept control over that process until 1968. And then things began to blow up.
I didn't mention 1860 and the Democrats. I recently covered that issue on a podcast with Sean Wilentz and Jim Oakes when we talked about the election of 1860. Talk about chaos. The Democrats twice tried to nominate somebody and it broke up. And there were two Democratic nominees for president in 1860. One in the North, one in the South. Folks can find that podcast episode wherever they find.
And you can also read about it in my book, What It Took to Win.
There you go.
Democratic Party.
Not a shameless plug. That's right. What It Took to Win. History of the Democratic Party.
Never shameless plugs, ever.
Well, we
ever.
discussed that book on C-SPAN together, and I put that out as an audio podcast as well. The History as It Happens catalog has something for everybody. So, I've never witnessed an open convention in my life. Maybe I'm romanticizing how cool it would be to have something like that today. But then I read about the 1924 Democratic National Convention, 103 ballots. It took 2 weeks. What happened, Michael Kazin?
Well, the party was split. Democrats have a long history, and they've often been in conflict. 1860 famously. 1960s famously, 1896 also, when William Jennings Bryan was this insurgent candidate and most establishment candidates would not support him, thought he was too radical. 1924, Democrats were also split. They were split on the issue of prohibition, which Southern Democrats were mostly for. Evangelical Protestants, who were an important group in the Democratic Party at the time, were for. But most urban Democrats, especially Catholics, were very much against. And also the Ku Klux Klan, which was at its height in 1924. The second Ku Klux Klan was reformed in 1915, had about 4 million members in 1924, not just in the South, but elsewhere in the country as well. And there was one candidate, a guy named William McAdoo, who was actually Woodrow Wilson's son-in-law, who was the candidate of the Prohibitionists, the candidate of the South, the candidate who was not going to support the Klan, but he wouldn't denounce it either. And then Al Smith, governor of New York, Catholic, a wet, as it was called. That is, he didn't like Prohibition. He liked to have his drinks. So they went to the convention, and the convention was split almost half and half.
Well, he would have had my vote, by the way. I wouldn't have been a fan of Prohibition either, but go ahead.
No, I know. You're an Al Smith guy. So the Happy Warrior, he was known as. You're a happy warrior yourself, or happy podcaster anyway. So it was in Madison Square Garden, which was New York City, which was where Al Smith was from. So the galleries were full of Al Smith supporters. William Jennings Bryan, the last year of his life, actually, it's a year before the Scopes trial, was a supporter of McAdoo. He was a supporter of Prohibition. He didn't like the Klan, but he thought denouncing it would lose votes too, so he spoke against denouncing it, officially at least. There was a vote in the convention about whether the convention should denounce the Klan or not. It lost by one vote out of several thousand. In other words, they couldn't agree. And this was embarrassing to the Democrats for lots of reasons. Not just they were split. It was the first convention to be broadcast on the radio.
Yeah, it was broadcast live.
Americans, if they felt like it, could actually listen for 2 weeks. You think this thing about the debate about Biden's age is going on for 2 weeks. Well, this was, nonstop. They got there in the morning in Madison Square Garden, and they left sometime late at night. So this was particularly embarrassing. And so after 103 ballots, they chose a non-entity, a Wall Street lawyer named John Davis, and they lost in a landslide to Calvin Coolidge.
Yeah, so there were 5 hours of debate on whether or not to denounce the Klan. That presaged the problems to come when it came to nominating an actual candidate for the Democratic ticket.
And ironically, if you don't mind me saying so, the last act in John Davis's life, actually, came almost exactly 30 years later when he defends South Carolina in the case which became known as Brown v. Board of Education. He begins his life as a compromise candidate for the Democrats. He ends his life, political life, defending segregation.
Oh, boy. One of the things I really loathe about the current primary is when they have those early primary debates and there are 15 people on the stage fighting for airtime. I mean, how's anyone supposed to distinguish themselves? At that 1924 convention, 58 different Democratic candidates received at least one vote from the delegates at some point during the balloting. 58.
And for the first time, a woman received a vote for vice president as well.
Oh, well, so there was some progress there. I mean, the Klan stuff.
She only got one vote, but she did get a vote. Because women could vote by 1924.
All right, 1968, the big one. You were there, if you don't mind a brief digression about what you were up to. You were too young to vote, but you went to Chicago to protest the Vietnam War and Hubert Humphrey getting the nomination. This was an open convention, right?
Open, yes, but it was pretty clear going in that Hubert Humphrey, the vice president, who did not run seriously in a single primary, by the way, in 1968, had enough delegates on his side to get the nomination. He was Lyndon Johnson's candidate, of course, and Johnson, even though he decided not to run again, was still in control of enough of the party to get his favored nominee in.
Okay.
So it was theoretically open, yes, but everyone knew going in it would have taken an earthquake for Humphrey not to get the nomination.
It's a weird year to analyze. Understatement of the century there. 1968, a weird year. More than that, tragic, tumultuous, damaging, embittering, all of the above. Because, there were primaries. LBJ never officially entered the race, so I guess it's wrong to say he dropped out of the race. He said he would not even seek the nomination in his March 31st, 1968 television speech that you celebrated there when you were watching that live.
I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Couple of weeks prior at the New Hampshire primary, LBJ, even though, again, he wasn't officially in the race, he nearly lost the primary to Eugene McCarthy. Bobby Kennedy won a very important primary, the California primary, in June, but then he was assassinated that night. I guess Eugene McCarthy, relatively unknown senator, a peace candidate, but he didn't really have a lot of traction. Did the primaries, I'm answering my own question here, Michael. Did the primaries really matter all that much in 68? I guess they did in some respects because it kind of drove LBJ out.
They mattered because it showed how much dissatisfaction there was with Johnson and Humphrey, for that matter. Humphrey didn't run those primaries because he knew he'd probably lose, and that would make him look very bad for him to get the nomination. So he didn't run. He knew he didn't have to by party rules. So McCarthy won a bunch of delegates. Kennedy, I should say, won a bunch of delegates before he was killed. Then George McGovern actually became, in effect, the stand-in for Bobby Kennedy. Most Kennedy delegates said they would support McGovern in 68. But again, that wasn't enough. But it showed the dissatisfaction. And I think it did lead to the Democrats naming a commission run by George McGovern, together with he was a senator then from South Dakota, together with a congressman from Minnesota named Fraser, Donna Fraser. And then they overhauled the whole system after 68 of choosing delegates. Wow. And not coincidentally, perhaps, George McGovern became the first recipient of those reforms when he was nominated in primaries in 1972 as a Democratic nominee. And the Republicans went along with that as well because they didn't want to seem undemocratic as well. So the nomination system was overhauled, not explicitly in order to make sure the primaries would choose the nominee before the convention, which is, of course, what's happened ever since, but because the Democrats wanted more diversity in their delegations. Most of the delegates in 1968 from any place in the country were older white men, some from trade unions, some from party machines, the kind of guys, and almost all guys, who would have been chosen as delegates going back into the 1930s and 1920s and even before them. Yeah. But the party was a different party by 68, and they wanted to make sure that those like me, who had opposed the nomination of Humphrey, would feel included in the party. Really, that was the impetus to make sure the primaries and also some caucuses, but still popularly elected delegates, would choose the nominee.
So in 68, then, you're saying it was this need to democratize the process, but also, I mean, it seems like the Democrats were pushed in this direction because of what happened not only inside the convention hall in Chicago, but outside on the streets where you were.
Yes, I actually was arrested at the convention, not actually for demonstrating, but for wearing a pin, a radical pin for the group Students for Democratic Society. But in all honesty, I had broken some windows in downtown Chicago. I was a 20-year-old hothead at the time, and I was very, very angry about the war. And people who were angry about the war, some of whom were radicals, some who were just angry liberals, or just people who hated the war, were an important part of the Democratic Party, as well as an important part of those protesting the Democratic Party. And so that is why those who ran the DNC at the time felt they really had to open up the process, or else they would lose a whole generation.
You mentioned a term before, bossism. You see a little of that when you watch the footage of the convention in 68. A senator, his last name escapes me, he goes up there, I think actually to nominate McGovern, and he talks...
Ribicoff, his name was Abraham Ribicoff from Connecticut.
So you know where I'm going. He denounces the Gestapo tactics.
And with George McGovern as President of the United States, we wouldn't have to have Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago.
The police were beating the living daylights out of protesters out on the streets, and you can see a party boss, Mayor Daley of Chicago, gritting his teeth. He wanted to kill him.
He didn't just grit his teeth, he yelled various obscenities at him.
That is true.
One of which was an anti-Semitic slur, because Ribicoff was Jewish. This was Daley's convention. This was Chicago. Daley was the boss of Chicago and had been the mayor for, I think, by then, 15, 16 years.
Wow.
So this was personal for Daley. And actually, people don't know this, but Daley was not a big Humphrey supporter, actually. He would have rather Bobby Kennedy been the nominee. He was Irish Catholic, was Daley. He'd been close to the Kennedys. Some people say he helped steal Illinois for John Kennedy in 1960. He was not crazy about the war either, but he really hated demonstrators. And of course, he really hated anybody who attacked his police.
So you can understand why parties today want the stage-managed, theatrical, 4-day, made-for-TV event that conventions have become. They want to avoid chaos. I think disagreement is healthy and politics are healthy, but no one wants chaos, and it's hard to know when disagreement may, cross the line into endless haggling and dissension, and, no one wants to come out of a convention looking like they're not unified around a nominee anymore, so it's understandable. So, as you said, early 1970s, we get our current convention system. they're not open anymore. We know who the nominee is going to be going in. Yet in 76, Reagan challenged Ford, and in 1980, Ted Kennedy challenged Carter. Was there any chance for either of those challengers to win?
Not really, because again, they didn't have enough votes. You would have had to have Ford people decide, well, we'll support Reagan. Remember, the Republicans then were actually quite split, not just between these two candidates. Ford, the incumbent president, who was, of course, not elected. He came in as Nixon's vice president when Nixon resigned 2 years before. But also, Ford was seen as a moderate. He was from Michigan. He was not opposed to strong labor unions. He was sort of go along with some of the programs that had been put in place during the New Deal and the Great Society. He wasn't a liberal, but he was certainly not a conservative the way Ronald Reagan was. Ronald Reagan was the leader of the conservative movement. He was very charismatic. He'd been governor of California for 2 terms before this. And so he was seen as the heir apparent by conservatives. But still, Ford controlled enough votes, and there were still enough Republicans who were afraid of nominating a conservative, believe it or not, in 1976, that they thought Ford was the safer choice. And actually, it's possible if Ford had not pardoned Richard Nixon, he actually might have won the election. We don't know. But it was a pretty close election against Jimmy Carter. It didn't seem close at first, but it became rather close.
When you listen to Ted Kennedy's speech at the 1980 convention, where Carter is now trying to fend off a challenge from Ronald Reagan, who wins the nomination on the GOP side in 1980, when you listen to Ted Kennedy's speech, you have to know the context there, because he's not explicitly bashing Carter. What he is saying is we need to be the party of the Liberal Party. We cannot forsake our liberal traditions. Kennedy did not think Carter was a true liberal.
For me, a few hours ago, this campaign came to an end. For all those whose cares have been our concern, the work goes on, the cause endures, the hope still lives, and the dream shall never die.
Did Kennedy hurt Carter?
I think he did. Actually, I was at that convention. I heard Kennedy's speech. I was in the gallery.
Yeah, I don't mean hurt his feelings, hurt his chances.
Oh, exactly. I was in Madison Square Garden, a different Madison Square Garden from 1924. It was clear that Kennedy was the darling of the galleries. Again, this was New York City, very liberal city, and Carter was very wounded. Now, it's also true, I think, that, yes, even though Kennedy didn't come close to getting enough votes to win the nomination in 1980, he did hurt Carter, because anytime you have a major split against the incumbent, or in 68, the incumbent vice president in the party, you weaken the party. The party seems disunited. Those who lose out in the primary fight, in this case, Kennedy's people, were embittered. They're not as excited about going out and canvassing for the candidate who beat their favorite candidate. So I think it did hurt him, just as Pat Buchanan hurt George H.W. Bush in 1992 when he ran a serious campaign against him. Having a major candidate battling an incumbent in the primaries and winning favor from an important chunk of the Democratic Party constituency is a serious problem for an incumbent. Incumbents who have had that in the modern era, incumbents who've had that battle against them have always lost.
So this brings us to the question of whether Democrats this year would have been better off had someone challenged Joe Biden many months ago rather than it coming to this.
Well, the problem, again, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, is that when you have a major primary challenger to an incumbent president, that incumbent president has always gotten the nomination and has always lost the general election. And Democrats obviously know that history. And also, after the midterm election in 2022, where Democrats did better than most of them expected to do, not because of Biden so much, but because of the Dobbs decision, a recoil by a lot of people against the repeal of Roe v. Wade, most Democrats were united behind Biden. They thought, yes, he's old. Yes, people think he's a little too old, but he's done a good job. It would be too disruptive to turn against him. The base of the party, labor unions, African Americans were for him. So you create a free-for-all, unclear who would have run.
Yeah.
Maybe whoever got the nomination would not be as strong as Biden. Yeah. There are too many uncertainties.
Yeah, because everybody is overshadowed by the president, including the vice president.
Politicians don't like uncertainties.
There really wasn't a groundswell for anybody. Maybe that's because no one really wanted to stick their neck out. Governor of California, the governor of Michigan, who?
The question is, if somebody runs, they'd probably still lose to Biden in the primaries, because this is before that terrible debate he had 2 weeks ago. So what's the point? You hurt the party, you don't win, you damage yourself for running 4 years later in 2028. So there's no reason to do it. And also, his polls were not good, but he wasn't 5-6 points behind as he is in some polls today. So Again, contingencies really matter in history.
And I might guarantee that if things don't work out well for Kamala Harris and the Democrats this November, there will be immediate second-guessing, if it hasn't started already, as to why President Biden did not withdraw from the race last year in 2023 to give his party enough time to find an adequate successor on the ticket. Michael Kazin of Georgetown University, we thank you. And on the next episode of History as It Happens, we're going to speak to Joseph Ellis about the founding generation, George Washington's wisdom, knowing when to quit, political power, holding office for as long as possible, maybe a bit overrated. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.